I do. Well, thanks all for coming, and thank you, Wilbert, for the introduction. And I've appreciated the past seminars that have, webinars that have talked about salinity, advection, feedback, and the broader circulation. And I'm going to be addressing this, but I'm going to be addressing it from very localized observations in the Florida current. And I think it's actually very instructive to see what's going on in such a fine scale, because I think there's lots of implications we can infer. And to start off with, I tossed up this schematic because I think it's important to remember that there's all of these complex processes that happen in the Atlantic basin, where we would normally think of just the AMOC and there's an upper branch and lower branch, but it's a complex region. And you can actually barely see the Florida Straits, the small little line in the box here, but that's where I'll be focusing on at the moment for this presentation. So in the past couple of years, there have been some interesting results that have been coming out from observations of the overturning. And I've, in particular, Susan Lozier presented a very insightful summary at a workshop earlier this summer that I think is a good way to think about where we are now. And it's that we consider the overturning to be large-scale coherent flow. That's why it's of such interest, is that it's globally relevant. But if you look at different components, it's not as simple as you'd expect. The deep western boundary current is in fact not continuous. If you put floats in it, work from E.B. Bauer and work from Lynn Talley and Susan Lozier finds that the surface Gulf Stream doesn't actually go into the subpolar gyre, so there's not that connection that we expect. And kind of more generally, there's pretty limited meridional coherence between different parts of the overturning or different branches that we think should be connected in gyres and the lower and upper branches and other places. And so I'm going to look a little bit upstream of this to the Florida current, because previous work has shown that this is where the upper branch overturning contributions from the northern and southern hemispheres come together. And the big question is, well, how continuous is the advective signal, say, of salt that's carried by the Florida current? So now this kind of feeds into the larger scale questions that we've been hearing about, and I think that one of the main concerns is overturning stability. And in particular, how does the ocean influence stability and provide feedback on what sets overturning stability? And the way that I think of this is that there's advection and diffusion, but those are of the ocean, and those carry anomalies that are imposed by a spatial pattern from the atmosphere. So if you look at just the advection component, that's what provides salt advection feedback, MOV coming into the southern boundary of the South Atlantic, and that's been discussed a lot here. I won't go over this background again. But you can kind of complicate this, and if you start talking about diffusion, this is a nice paper by Paula Chessy and Christopher Wolf. They found that the relative balance of advection and diffusion really sets the state of overturning and its stability. But this last component, the air-sea forcing, I think imposes other constraints on this whole process that I'll be talking about a little bit today. To kind of give a regional perspective of what's going on, I'm showing some results from Bill Johns, where he took a regional model of the North Atlantic, he forced it with winds, and then he imposed an overturning, upper branch overturning onto that. And the, I guess, pink lines are stream functions, and the black arrows are the flow related to overturning. So you can see that all of the overturning, at this point, Bill Johns picked 14 fair routes for overturning. All of this overturning volume transport goes into the Caribbean to the Windward Islands, and then you get these streamlines coming in from the gyre that add to that and give you the 14 thread groups to the Florida Straits out of the 32 thread groups that we know go through that constriction. So what I want to ask is, well, that's how the volume transport goes, but where does, what sort of salt signal does it carry, and where does that signal come from? And this gets to whether you consider the western boundary here to be a pipe, or maybe it's a leaky pipe, or maybe it's something entirely different. So the data that I'm working with, it all comes from 9 stations between Florida and Bahamas, just downstream of the cables that give us a continuous transport time series that is used for the overturning calculations used by the rapid array. We're very lucky in that NOAA, Chris Minan and Molly Derringer and others have been collecting CTD measurements, CTD LED CP transects, so lowered acoustic Doppler current profiler, about 4 times a year. So they've been out there since 2000, and they'll only look up until 2014, and there's 51 transects. So it's a fabulous data set. And we're lucky that there was a similar effort back in the 80s focusing on the Florida current that has either CTD measurements or velocity measurements. Unfortunately, they weren't taken at the same time, but that gives us about 11 transects. So I won't go into how all of the data is processed, but I average it on isopycnals, I grid it, I integrate it, I do lots of processing, but I just want to show the results here. And the kind of starting point of all of this is just the structure along this transect. And you can see that I have temperature here and salinity, that there's very strong stratification. There's actually quite a lot of structure from side to side, and we see kind of key water masses. There's surface water above about 100 meters. I define it as lighter than 24 kilograms per meter squared, sigma theta. This is water that's in contact with the atmosphere. It has a seasonal cycle in temperature, and it's somewhat hard to interpret because it is so closely linked with the atmosphere that it's not necessarily a purely advective signal from the ocean because it's continuously being modified. Then at the bottom of this transect, you have Antarctic intermediate water. It's cold and it's fresh. And this is a clear signature from the Southern Ocean, which is where this water mass is formed. And I define this layer by anything heavier than 27. And then there's this big expanse of what I call intermediate water between these 2 layers. That's decently stratified, but there are 2 distinct water masses on the eastern side that come from the subtropical North Atlantic. There's 18-degree water, a well-known water mass, and there's this, what I call North Atlantic salinity maximum water that's related to salty water formed in the center of the gyre. And then this intermediate layer I further divide into east and west based on potential vorticity argument. So this line is where, in fact, it tells potential vorticity has strong horizontal gradients. And this is often a way that we look at large currents like the Gulf Stream or the Agulhas, and we say the exchange of water across this line is difficult because of dynamical arguments. And I do note that, realize that this calculation makes a number of assumptions that might not be valid in this location, but I will hold off discussing the validity of this line until my next slide. So this is kind of the basic structure of the straits, and I'm going to talk about 3 different aspects of this to relate it to ocean advection. I'm going to talk about mean transport. I'm going to talk about changes of water properties from the 80s to since the 2000s. I'm going to talk about changes in salt transport, which is ultimately what determines salt advection and stability. So in terms of the mean transport, the most basic question is, well, which of these water masses supplies overturning? And here I'm plotting this now against potential density, because this is I want to preserve water masses in my analysis. And you see the same for water masses I defined earlier. So this is kind of a very basic question. We know the overturning needs 17 or 18 surge groups, depending which time frame you look at. And based on dynamical arguments, it's pretty certain that this western intermediate water is very well positioned to escape the subtropical gyre and go to the subpolar gyre. So that's a clear contributor to overturning. Also, if we look deeper, this Antarctic intermediate water, in fact, doesn't have a potential vorticity boundary. It's below the region of strong stratification, and so this water mass can very easily slide under the core of the current, if not here, then downstream the Gulf Stream, and that can have an easy path to get to the subpolar gyre. The surface water is a little bit less clear because it's forced a lot by the atmosphere, and I definitely don't think that the surface layer reaches the subpolar gyre, but maybe the lower half of it is able to transition into the subpolar gyre, and it's going to be more likely the western side of it that can go on northward. And so I think maybe 2.5 surge groups can come from the surface water. So if you add up these numbers, you get about 11 surge groups, and that's a little over than half of the overturning that's needed. So it's pretty clear that the salty eastern intermediate water that shows signatures from the subtropics has to be a pretty strong contributor to overturning. And it seems like it's about a third from the North Atlantic subtropics, a third from the Southern Ocean, South Atlantic, and then this other water mass, we don't really know where it comes from. It has no distinct features. So that's a kind of a clear breakdown of what could be feeding the overturning in terms of volume transport. I haven't talked about salt yet. So now I'd like to consider water mass properties. And these are, I've taken 3 stations in the Florida Straits, and I'm plotting temperature against salinity. So to go back, I'm looking at stations 2 here, 5, which is on the deepest part, and then 8, which is all the way on the eastern side. And I'm looking at just the average values for these 2 time frames with the standard error by these small lines. And it's pretty obvious that there's this massive increase in salinity here. And to actually do this properly, you have to look at core water mass properties. And if you do that for the salinity maximum water, for H&DV water, or for this bottom Antarctic intermediate water, all of them show pretty clear signs that they've just gotten saltier. So now I'd like to look at the whole strait. The difference in salinity, the 2000s minus the 80s. And aside from the surface layer that is somewhat hard to analyze because it has a seasonal signal, it's gotten saltier everywhere. These dark lines are the average salinity. So this is kind of the salinity maximum core over here, and the PV separation. So to understand where this goes, there's a bunch of papers by Paul Dirac and Susan Weifels that say it looks like there's just this first order intensification of the hydrological cycle because of a warming atmosphere. And so that has the effect that there's more evaporation in evaporative regions, so those regions get saltier, and precipitative regions, like the Southern Ocean, where AAIW was formed, those get fresher because there's more precipitation. But as where we are here, if you look in the Southern Ocean, this AAIW has gotten fresher, but that signature is no longer present at this location. In fact, it's become saltier. So it looks like this input of salt in the subtropical North Atlantic gyre is kind of the main feature that's driving trends in salinities over the past 2.5 decades. And then if you kind of be a bit more careful and include significance for these differences, the shaded regions are insignificant by varying amounts. It's this intermediate layer that's really the most significant, especially so in this eastern side where the subtropical water masses are found. There's less significance on a point-by-point basis in this deep layer, but there's still some signs of it. And you can definitely analyze this aspect much more closely by looking at stratification, but these points are not necessary for the points I'm making here, so I'll skip over them. And so now I'd like to get to salt transport, which is kind of the main factor. But before I do that, it's hard to come up with a meaningful salt transport if you don't have a region where mass is conserved. So the Florida Strait has so much water going northward that if you just multiply salinity by velocity and you integrate, you get something like 1,000 square root PSUs, which is in fact pretty much all canceled by the southward flow of slightly fresher water in the interior at depth, which carries about 1,000 square root PSU southward. So that cancels. It's not a dynamically meaningful contribution, and so I want to subtract that out and get something that's we can interpret in a meaningful way. And to do this, I break up the transect kind of with this mathematical approach. It comes from Harry Dryden and Elaine Masdana. You essentially have a base and average value, an average profile that integrates to 0 in the vertical. Then you have a residual that has all of the asymmetric components in it. And when you use any of these quantities as reference values in this integration, now you get these different components. So the true flow in the Florida Straits, it's just average ocean salinity of about 35. It's meaningless because it's canceled out by the deep branch of the overturning. But then you get the overturning, and if you subtract the average, now if you look across the whole ocean, the surface ocean is salty, and that carries salt northward, and the deep ocean is relatively fresh, and that carries fresh water southward. And that's what we know the overturning circulation does carry. And then you can also get the gyre contribution, and this is related to northward flow on the western side and southward flow on the eastern side. So it's zonally asymmetric. So with this kind of framework, I calculate the salt transport as applicable for the gyre and for the overturning. And I look at the differences that we see. So I'm using the water masses I've defined earlier. And what you see if you look for the gyre, all of these quantities are negative, which is what you expect because the gyre is evaporative, so you need to bring in fresh water from the western side. But if you notice the difference, they're carrying much more salt northward, or I guess much less fresh water northward. And I don't really consider this a dynamical feature because the gyre is a surface feature. It doesn't take that long to go around. It's in pretty good equilibrium with the atmosphere. So it's just showing that there's more evaporation in the gyre. The overturning, on the other hand, is a much slower process. And I think the changes we see are of more importance. But we do see that all of these water masses carry salt northward, which is what we need for the overturning. We know this already from previous studies. But the only difference is that this bottom layer used to carry fresh water northward. Now it's carrying salt water northward, and the difference is actually quite strong. And if you look at the total salt transport carried by the Florida current, it's gotten it carries significantly more salt now than it did in the 80s. But you also see that the intermediate water has large values that cancel. And I'm not showing it, but this is related to an exchange of about one sphere group between these two water masses. And so that's showing that these intermediate waters that have a strong solidifying trend can shift water around, and that really will be the largest impact possible on what ends up going northward. And just kind of it shows that there's a large impact from the subtropics. So to conclude, in the region I've been looking at, I found that the subtropical North Atlantic has a quite large impact on supplying waters for the average northward volume transport. It impacts decadal trends in salinity, decadal salinification, but it also has caused increases of northward salt transport. And from these, I infer that there's quite important mixing that's happening between the subtropical gyre and the western boundary that's essential for setting the northward salt fluxes. As you kind of step back and go back to my introductions, this conclusion is quite is in agreement with other recent findings observationally, and I think it also provides an appealing hypothesis for why there's such a difference in advective diffusive balance between coarse resolution models and the resulting simulations that are able to better resolve these interior mixing pathways that we see from observations. Okay, well that's it, and I hope that I've stimulated some questions.
Great, thanks, Sully. Wilbur, go ahead.
Very nice, Sully. I really appreciated your presentation. It's indeed very, very stimulating to think about these things when you're used to thinking about these things more from a model perspective. So the question that I have is, in terms of this salt advection feedback, the classical thing that Stommel proposed, in his view, basically the salt advection feedback would be visible in a strengthening of the flow that would then carry more salt northward, basically. I didn't really see, maybe I missed it, but did you show any changes, or have there been any changes in the transport been observed associated with these changes in the salinity?
Yes. In terms of the data that I'm looking at, the answer is no. So the Florida current time series goes back from the cable goes back to the 80s. 82, I think 1982 is when it started, and there's been no trends observed in that time series, but there's lots of variability at high frequencies, and so it's a very difficult place to take measurements because there's just it's hard to get a good average. And the data that I have just from synaptic transects, even though I have 60 total, that's completely insufficient to be looking at changes in volume transport, and there are no significant changes in volume transport that I see or that anybody has found, to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
Great. I think everyone's off mute, so if you have any questions, go ahead and chime in. Maybe introduce yourself first.
Hi, Zoe. I enjoyed that talk very much. Thank you. This is Steve Yeager. I guess what I'm wondering is if there's any potential to look at salt content changes north of Florida Strait, sort of, following along the lines of Stuart Cunningham et al., their GRL paper in 2013, where they related the downturn in the rapid measured AMOC transport in 2009, 2010, with a cooling of the subtropical Atlantic just north of 26 North. Is there enough data to see whether there might be a detectable change in salt content north of Florida Strait?
Yes, that's a very good point, and I think there is enough data. It's not. It requires a completely different approach and different data sets. And to my knowledge, I think that Elaine McDonough is working on just those types of calculations. I think Molly might be involved in that. But so that's work in progress, and I don't know the status. But yeah, they want to do the same analysis that Stuart did for heat storage, for salt storage, and actually other constituents also. But yeah, no, it definitely seems like that's the consensus I'm seeing, is that it's not so much continuous advection by boundary currents, but it's storage in gyres and then exchange between gyres that's driving changes in overturning. That would be my guess.
Can I ask another question, Zoe?
Yes,
might be a bit outside of the realm, outside of the range here, but there have been studies that suggest that Agulhas leakage contributes to the salt balance of the North Atlantic as well. Is there anything in the observations that would support that? I'm not sure. Maybe if salinity is the right metric for that, but maybe some other traces or so that can tell where these water masses are coming from?
Yes, that's a question that's been very much on my mind, and it would need a dedicated effort to look into that. I don't understand. I haven't worked in the South Atlantic at all, frankly, so I don't understand the circulation pathways there. But at least as far as the Florida Straits, or even if you look upstream in the Caribbean, you can also, aside from T and S, you can look at oxygen, you can look at nutrients and other quantities. But even if you do that, and there's less data to use if you want to use more parameters, I don't think it's possible in the Caribbean or downstream to find a water mass, a clear signature of the Agulhas. And I think what I would like to see to kind of make that connection is kind of how somebody tracing a pathway from the Agulhas leakage in the, off of, the Agulhas retroflexion, kind of follow that leakage and see what pathway it takes. Because you can see how it goes volumetrically, but if the same processes I see happening in the Florida Straits are also happening in the South Atlantic, there's going to be lots of mixing with the interior and dilution of any signal as you go down that pathway. And so what I see is that there are these signals. Water, obviously, in a volumetric sense, has to be coming from the Southern Ocean, from the South Atlantic, to supply overturning. But because you have an increasing influence by diffusion into the western boundary current, as you go along the pathway, it's the closer sources that dominate trends when you're looking at the Florida Strait. So I think it's a complex question that you need to really quantify how much of a contribution a distant strong source has compared to a close surface source contribution has. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There must be a lot of dilution taking place before it even gets to the equator or so. In my mind, the influence is more just basically what you say, that it's more like an exchange between the gyres than really this ribbon of water going from the Agulhas leakage area all the way across the South Atlantic and straight into the North Atlantic. I think it's probably, at least on the longer time scales, a better way to look at it is like filling up a bucket in the South Atlantic and then that signal then spills over to the North Atlantic or so.
Yes, yeah, I agree very much.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's especially the parts of the pathway where it's carried by eddies, like often the Agulhas here and the North Brazil current turns into eddies, so it's even less continuous than you might think for, say, the Gulf Stream. So, yeah, definitely needs further study.
Nice.